The Duke asked where she had learned to set a broken bone. Marianne Vane, 22, knelt on the stone floor of the Northumberland stable, her sleeves pinned back, a groom's shattered forearm steadied between her palms. She told him the truth. She had learned it at Millbrook Jail. She did not stop working as she said it. She did not look up. She drew the splint tight, felt the man's pulse flutter beneath her fingers, and said the word jail the way another woman might have said Bath or Brighton. It was, in her mouth, an unremarkable place. A body might have passed through it on the way to somewhere finer. The Duke of Ashcombe did not move. He stood in the doorway of the stable, rain still darkening the shoulders of his coat. He was a man of compact, solid build, one who had never in his life needed height to command a room. He watched the woman his household had hired 11 days prior as a companion nurse to his invalid aunt. She set a bone with the calm, economical hands of a surgeon twice her age. His eyes were a warm brown, unusual in a man so often described by the servants as cold. And in them now was something sharper than suspicion. It was recognition. He had seen hands move like that before, in a field hospital outside Victoria, on men who did not survive the men who tended them. A prison, he said again, as though the word might rearrange itself into something more palatable on a second hearing. Yes, Your Grace. She tied off the linen strip, and only then lifted her eyes to his. They were grey-green and steady, and utterly without apology. 6 years. I was the surgeon's assistant there before I was anything else. It would be many weeks before he learned the rest of it. She had entered Millbrook not as a nurse, but as a prisoner herself, convicted at 16 of a theft she had not committed. She had earned her place at the surgeon's table only because the alternative was the laundry, and the laundry killed women faster than the fever did. But that day, in the stable, with the groom's arm splintered and his colour returning, the Duke of Ashcombe asked no more questions. He said only, "See that Dr. Fenwick examines it tomorrow," and walked back into the rain. Marianne watched him go and thought, not for the first time, that she had traded one set of iron gates for another, gentler only in appearance. She had come to Ashcombe Keep under a name that was not entirely her own. Vane was her mother's family, an old name gone to seed. No one in Northumberland had reason to connect a companion nurse called Vane to the Marianne Holt who had walked out of Millbrook Jail 4 years earlier. She had left with only a character reference from a prison surgeon, and nothing else in the world. She had built herself, brick by careful brick, into a woman who could be trusted with an invalid dowager's medicines and a household's small emergencies. She had done it by never once mentioning where the skill had come from. Until today. Until a groom's arm had needed setting, faster than anyone could fetch the physician from Alnwick. She had simply done what her hands knew how to do, in front of the one man in the county whose good opinion she could least afford to lose, and had never once sought. The Dowager Duchess, bedridden these 8 months with a wasting complaint the London doctors called consumption of the joints and could not otherwise name, was the reason Marianne had come to the keep at all. Lady Ashcombe was sharp-tongued and exacting, and had dismissed 4 companions before Marianne in as many years. She had taken to the new one within a fortnight, chiefly because Marianne did not flinch from the smell of the sick room, nor flatter the old woman's temper. She managed the pain drafts, too, with a precision the previous companions had lacked. What none of that fortnight had required, until the stable, was for Marianne's competence to be witnessed by the Duke himself. He had been abroad with his regiment when she arrived. He had returned to Ashcombe Keep only 3 weeks past, cold, exact, and, the servants agreed, in the particular hush reserved for the master's temper, changed. He had gone to war a young man, with a father's coldness bred into him. He had come home a colder one still, hardened by 6 years in the Peninsula and at Waterloo. It showed itself only in small things, the way he could not sit with his back to a door, and the long silences at dinner that the household had learned not to fill. His valet said he did not sleep past 3. His steward said he had not smiled since Victoria, wherever that was. and no one below stairs was certain if it was a town, or a battle, or both. What was certain was that the Duke of Ashcombe, 35 and unmarried, moved through his own house like a man walking the perimeter of a wound he would not let anyone examine. What no one in that house yet understood was that the Duke had recognized something in the stable beyond a skilled hand. He had recognized a particular species of composure, the composure of a person who has already survived the worst thing that will happen to them, and has therefore stopped flinching at smaller catastrophes. He knew that composure because he wore a version of it himself, though his had been bought with a saber, and hers, apparently, with a jail sentence. He found he could not stop turning the fact over, the way a man worries at a coin in his pocket without meaning to spend it. 3 days after the stable, he sent for her. She came to his study expecting dismissal. A companion who had misrepresented her history to a ducal household, even by omission, even by simply never volunteering it, could reasonably expect to be paid through the quarter and shown the road. She stood before his desk with her hands folded and her spine very straight. Somewhere in the walk from the East Wing, she had already composed the sentence she would use to thank him for his consideration. She meant to ask for a character that did not mention the reason for her departure. He did not give her the chance to speak it. 6 years, he said, is a long sentence for a girl who would have been 16 at its start. It was the sentence given. For what offense? Theft, Your Grace. A silver spoon, taken, the court was told, from the house where I was in service. She did not drop her eyes. I did not take it. The housekeeper's own nephew did, and swore otherwise. A scullery girl's word carries less weight than a housekeeper's. Most courts I have encountered would agree. The Duke studied her for a long moment. Something in his face, not softened precisely, but stilled, the way a held breath stills a room, made her wonder if he was deciding whether to believe her, or perhaps he already did and did not know what to do with the belief. You could have told no one, and continued as Miss Vane the companion, and none of this would have surfaced, he said. I could not set a man's arm and pretend my hands had learned their trade at a finishing school, Your Grace. She paused. There are lies I have been willing to carry. This is not one of them. It was the first crack, though neither of them named it as such. It was not attraction, not yet, but the particular vertigo of being seen accurately by someone whose good opinion mattered more than either had planned for. The Duke of Ashcombe had not trusted an unguarded word from anyone in 6 years. He found himself trusting this one, and did not examine too closely why. He did not dismiss her. He told her instead that Dr. Fenwick would need an assistant twice weekly among the tenant families whose ailments outpaced one physician's calendar. Her skills, he said, were wasted solely on his aunt's sick room. It was not warmth. It read, to the household, a simple practicality. The Duke had always been a man who put resources to their most efficient use, and a nurse was a nurse, jail-trained or otherwise. But Marianne understood it for what it was, a door left open rather than closed. He had chosen not to spend the one weapon that would have ended her position. He had decided, in the space of one conversation, that he did not wish to use it. She did not know yet that the Duke's own coldness was not indifference, but architecture. It had been built plank by a father who had told him, at 9 years old, that a man of his rank did not weep and did not confide. Such a man did not, under any circumstance, allow a servant to witness him in want of anything. She did not know that Vittoria had cost him a friend whose death he blamed, privately and without evidence, on his own hesitation. Nor did she know that he had returned from the war, certain that closeness of any kind was simply a debt collected later, in grief. What she knew was that a man everyone called cold had just declined an easy cruelty, and that the declining had cost him something in the doing. The tenant rounds began the following week. It was there, among the sick children and gout-ridden farmers, and one difficult breech birth that Dr. Fenwick handled badly and Marianne quietly corrected. It was there that the household began to notice what the Duke had noticed first. She did not flinch. She did not perform gentleness for an audience. She simply administered it, efficiently, the way she administered everything. The tenants who had feared the ducal household as a distant, indifferent authority began instead to ask for the Duke's nurse by name. He rode with her twice, ostensibly to inspect tenant cottages that wanted repair, and both times found himself watching her hands rather than the roofs. On the second occasion, at the cottage of a widow whose youngest boy had taken a fever, Marianne worked through the night without complaint. The Duke, who had not intended to stay past an hour, stayed until dawn, holding a basin, fetching water, doing the unglamorous errands of a sick room. He found he did not wish to leave her to do them alone. Neither of them spoke of what this meant. The silence between them had become its own language. There were other visits that autumn, and each one taught him something further about the woman his household had hired as an afterthought. He watched her turn away a farmer's offer of coin for a berth well managed, taking instead only a promise of eggs through the winter. She had learned in a jail laundry that money offered by the desperate was money they could not spare, whatever they insisted. He watched her sit with a dying grandmother for the better part of a night. It was not because the woman's ailment required a nurse's hand any longer, but because the woman had asked, plainly, not to die alone. Marianne had judged that request more urgent than her own exhaustion. He said nothing of what he observed. He filed it away, the way he had once filed away the positions of enemy guns, cataloguing a woman's character with the same grave attention he had once given to a battlefield. Both, he had learned, required accuracy. Sentiment applied carelessly to either was how men died. She, in turn, learned things of him that the household gossip had gotten wrong in nearly every particular. The servants called him cold, and he was, in company, in the ballroom, at the dinner table where performance was expected of him. But she had seen him kneel in a cottage doorway to speak, at a child's eye level, to a boy too frightened of the ducal presence to answer Dr. Fenwick's questions. She had seen the same exacting man surrender an entire afternoon to sitting beside his aunt's bed, reading aloud from a novel the Dowager Duchess pretended to find tedious, and plainly did not. Coldness, Marianne began to understand, was not the absence of feeling in him. It was feeling, with the door locked from the inside. She recognized the architecture, because she had built something similar herself, only her door had been locked by a courtroom rather than a father. "You are not what a jail ought to produce," he said, as they rode back in the grey early light, the fever broken and the boy sleeping. "Prisons do not produce anything, Your Grace. They only fail to destroy what was already there." She said it without bitterness, a simple correction of fact, the kind she had learned to make in 6 years of being underestimated. "I was a competent girl before Millbrook. I was merely an unprotected one. That is not the same as guilty." He absorbed this the way he absorbed most things now, silently, without answering. But something in his bearing had loosened by the smallest possible degree, the way ice loosens at its very edge before anyone would call it thawed. It could not last without incident. Lady Caroline Prescott, the Duke's second cousin, and the woman the Dowager Duchess had long favoured as a match for him, arrived at Ashcombe Keep for the autumn house party. She had the particular instinct of a woman who senses a rival before she can name one. Caroline was accomplished, wealthy, and entirely conventional in her expectations, possessed of an income of £8,000 and a face admired across 2 London seasons. The Dowager Duchess had given her every reason, in years past, to believe that a match with her cousin the Duke was a matter of patience rather than uncertainty. She arrived at the Keep, expecting to find a household awaiting her arrangement, and found instead a companion nurse, whose name the servants spoke with a warmth Caroline had not yet earned in 3 visits. She noticed it first at the threshold, when the Duke himself, rather than a footman, came out into the drive to hand the ladies down from their carriage. His eye went, before it reached Caroline at all, to a window on the east side of the house where the sick room's curtains had been drawn back to let in the autumn light. Caroline followed his glance and saw nothing remarkable in it, merely a curtain, merely a window, and thought little of it. But by the second evening, She had observed the same eye travel the same direction twice more. She understood, with the particular sharpness of a woman accustomed to being the most interesting object in any room, that she was no longer certain of that position. By the fourth day, she had learned, through a chain of servants' gossip she encouraged rather than discouraged, that the companion nurse had once been a convicted thief. It was, she told herself, precisely the sort of fact a household ought to know, precisely the sort of fact that would restore matters to their proper order. She selected the dinner table on the fifth evening, with a full complement of guests to witness it, as the setting for its delivery. "A criminal," Caroline said to the assembled house party at dinner, her voice pitched to carry the length of the table. "Attending upon a dying woman. I wonder the Duke permits it." The room's attention swung to Marianne, seated well below the salt among the household's senior staff, as etiquette demanded. She did not defend herself. She had learned in a jail laundry that defense offered to an audience already decided against you only fed the appetite for spectacle. She set down her fork and said nothing at all, which unsettled the table rather more than protest would have. It was the Duke who spoke. "Miss Vane's history is known to me," he said, in the low, exact voice the household had learned meant the matter was closed. "It does not concern my other guests." He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. "I would remind the table that Dr. Fenwick himself has said her hand steadied a birth he could not manage. My aunt's comfort these 8 months is owed largely to a skill this house was fortunate enough to acquire, wherever it was learned." Caroline's smile did not move, but something behind it did. "How generous of your Grace to overlook a criminal record." "There is nothing to overlook," he said. "A conviction obtained on a housekeeper's nephew's word, against a 16-year-old scullery maid, in a court that did not trouble to ask a second question, is not a stain upon Miss Vane's character. It is a stain upon the court's." The table fell silent in the particular way a room falls silent when it has witnessed something it will discuss for a fortnight. Marianne did not look at him. She could not, in that moment, trust her own composure to hold if she did. And composure was the one inheritance Millbrook had left her that she meant to keep. Had anyone been watching closely, they might have seen that the Dowager Duchess, at the head of the table, had set down her own fork with a small, satisfied precision. It was as though a suspicion long held had just been confirmed to her liking. She said nothing further that evening. She had learned, in 8 months of illness, that her nephew required no assistance in a fight he had already decided to win. She preferred, in any case, to deliver her own opinion on the matter in private, where it would land with greater weight. She summoned Marianne to her sick room the following afternoon, dismissed the housemaid, and regarded her companion for a long moment over the rim of a cooling cup of barley water. "You will not apologize to me," the Dowager said, "for a crime you did not commit, and I will not insult you by asking whether you did. I have watched you empty my chamber pot and read me sermons I despise. I have watched you hold my hand through nights I did not expect to survive. I have formed my own judgment of your character. It owes nothing whatsoever to a magistrate in a county I have never visited." She paused. "What I wish to know is whether you love my nephew, or whether you have simply grown accustomed to being needed by him. There's not the same condition. I buried one husband who confused the two." Startled into something nearer honesty than she had permitted herself in months, Marianne admitted that she did not know how to separate the two feelings any longer. To her considerable surprise, the Dowager Duchess laughed, a short, dry sound, rusty with disuse. She told her that was, in the old woman's long experience, as close to the genuine article as anyone ever arrived. What followed would not be spoken of for a generation in the county's ordinary way of speaking of things. Caroline Prescott, having overreached in a room full of witnesses, found her own position at Ashcombe Keep quietly and permanently altered. The Dowager Duchess had favoured the match for its convenience rather than its warmth. But she informed her nephew the following morning that she had never in 8 months of illness been so well tended as by Miss Vane. She would thank the household, she added, to stop discussing the girl's past as though it were a scandal rather than an injustice remembered. Caroline departed within the week, her invitation not renewed, and the house exhaled. But the Duke's defense of her, public and unflinching, had done something neither of them could unspeak. It had named, before witnesses, an esteem that had been building in private for 2 months, and both of them now had to decide what to do with the truth spoken aloud. He found her in the still room 3 nights later, grinding willow bark for the Dowager's evening draught, and he did not announce himself with the usual formality. He stood in the doorway, the way he had stood in the stable doorway on the first day, and he said, "I did not defend you for my aunt's comfort." Marianne set down the pestle. "Your Grace, Gideon," he said, "you have set my groom's arm and sat through my aunt's worst nights, and held a fevered child until dawn beside me. And still you call me by a title, as though I were a stranger to you." "You are a duke," she said carefully, "and I am a nurse who was once a prisoner. The distance is not a courtesy, sir. It is a fact. It is a fact I find I no longer wish to observe." He crossed the small room and stopped at a distance that was not improper. It was, for the first time since she had known him, chosen rather than maintained. "I've spent 6 years believing that closeness costs more than it returns. I watched a man die at Vittoria because I hesitated 1/2 second too long to reach in. I have not permitted myself to reach for anything since, in case the reaching failed again. You do not hesitate. I have watched you not hesitate for 2 months, over broken bones and fevers, and a table full of people ready to condemn you. I find that I would rather risk the reaching than continue as I am." It was not a declaration dressed in poetry. It was, Marianne thought, exactly the declaration a man like Gideon would make, precise, factual, and entirely without artifice, which was somehow more devastating than any sonnet could have been. "I have a criminal record," she said, because it needed saying once more, plainly, before either of them went further. "It will follow me. It will follow anyone connected to me." She held his gaze. "Your family will not easily forgive it, whatever your aunt says tonight." "My family," said the Duke of Ashcan, "has forgiven a great deal less deserving of forgiveness than an unjust conviction against a child. I am rather more concerned with what you wish, Marianne, than with what my family will tolerate." She had not heard her given name in his voice before. It landed somewhere beneath the composure she had built so carefully. For the first time in 6 years, in a still room smelling of willow bark and beeswax, Marianne Vane allowed her hands to be still. "I wish," she said, "not to be a scandal you must defend twice a year." "Then let us make certain there is nothing left to defend." He held out his hand. It was not, exactly, in the manner of a proposal, but in the manner of a man who had learned, at last, that reaching was not always followed by loss. "I intend to write to the Millbrook magistrate myself, and to the original complainant's household. I mean to have the conviction examined properly, by men who will ask the second question your original trial did not. Whatever the law can restore to you, I mean to see restored." She took his hand, not because the gesture solved anything. It was, she understood, the first time in her adult life that anyone had offered to fight for her name without first asking what it would cost them. There remained, even so, the ordinary machinery of the world to be managed, and neither of them pretended otherwise. A duke did not simply marry a companion nurse of uncertain origins without occasioning comment from every quarter of the ton, conviction overturned or not. Gideon spent the better part of a fortnight in correspondence with his solicitors, his bankers, and, with rather more care, his late father's oldest and most conservative friend. This last was a bishop, whose good opinion he had no particular need of, but whose ill opinion he preferred to forestall before it could reach his aunt's ears and trouble her failing health. He conducted these negotiations with the same exactness he had once given to troop dispositions. Each evening he told Marianne plainly, precisely what ground had been gained and what remained contested. He had decided, somewhere in the still room, that he would not be a man who managed her future without her full knowledge of the managing. "You need not fight every one of them for me," she told him one evening, watching him seal a letter to the bishop with rather more force than the wax required. "I've survived worse opinions than a bishop's." "I do not fight them for you," he said. "I fight them because I find, now that I have decided what I want, that I have very little patience left for anyone suggesting I ought to want something else." He almost smiled. "It is, I am told, rather unlike me. My aunt finds it hugely entertaining." The Dowager Duchess did, in fact, find it hugely entertaining, and said so at every opportunity. She delighted in her nephew's uncharacteristic willingness to spend his considerable social capital on a fight most men of his rank would have avoided as beneath their notice. She lived, that winter, with a vigour the London doctors had not predicted, as though scandal well managed agreed with her constitution better than illness ever had. She took particular pleasure, too, in receiving and answering with relish the letters of a cousin or two who wrote to express concern over the match. The magistrate's inquiry took the better part of a winter, and it was not, in its early weeks, an easy passage. The original complainant's household had long since scattered, the housekeeper dead, her nephew removed to Liverpool under a name Marianne herself had never learned. For some weeks it seemed the matter would resolve into nothing more than a duke's earnest but fruitless correspondence. Marianne bore this waiting with the same composure she brought to everything. Gideon watched her across the breakfast table on the mornings a solicitor's letter brought no new information. He began to understand that her stillness was not the absence of fear, but its careful management, practiced daily until it no longer showed. He found he wished, more than he had wished for anything since Vittoria, to give her a victory she had not had to manage her way through alone. It was his own steward, a methodical man named Whitfield, who had served 3 dukes and buried his private opinions along with 2 of them, who eventually broke the impasse. He located an aging former housekeeper, retired now to a cottage near Berwick, willing at last to confirm what she had long suspected and never said aloud. Her nephew, she admitted, had boasted in his cups, more than once, of a silver spoon pawned in a Newcastle shop. He had spoken, too, of a scullery girl who had taken the blame. In her own words, she had hanged for it in all but name, poor lamb. She had never had the courage to say so while her nephew lived under her roof. The woman wept through most of her statement, and signed it besides. Whitfield rode through a January sleet to deliver it into the Duke's own hands, rather than trust it to a courier. The conviction was not merely pardoned, but formally overturned, an act rare enough that the county newspapers carried it as a curiosity of justice, rather than a mere legal footnote. Rarer still was the fact that the Duke of Ashcombe's own name was attached to the petition that achieved it, lending it a weight no solicitor's letter alone could have managed. There were those in London who murmured that a duke ought not to spend his consequence on a servant's old conviction. But there were others, more as the winter wore on, who observed something different. A man willing to spend his consequence so plainly on behalf of the truth was not a man easily moved from any position he had properly examined. Lady Caroline Prescott, from her diminished vantage in London, heard of the overturned conviction and of the wedding that followed it within the same season. She found she had nothing further to say on the subject of criminals attending upon dying women, since the criminal in question was, by spring, the Duchess of Ashcombe. The dying woman, for her part, had lived to dance, however carefully, at the wedding breakfast. They were married in the small stone chapel at Ashcombe in April, with the Dowager Duchess seated in a chair carried specially to the front pew. Marianne wore grey-green to match her eyes rather than the fashionable white the London modistes recommended. Gideon had told her once, in the still room, that he preferred her exactly as she had always been, rather than as convention required her to become. The Tennant families came too, the same widow whose boy had survived his fever, the farmer who had offered coin and been given eggs instead. They filled the back pews without invitation and were not turned away. The bride had made plain to the vicar beforehand that anyone she had tended in the county was welcome at her wedding, whether or not their name appeared on a formal list. The vows were brief, as period practice demanded, but the Duke's voice, ordinarily so controlled that the household had taken bets, in whispered fun, on whether he possessed any register beyond it, caught once on the word cherish. No one in the chapel pretended not to notice, least of all his bride. Her own composure, that famous, unshakable composure that had carried her through a courtroom, a jail laundry, and a dinner table of hostile witnesses, very nearly failed her. It was the only time in the whole of this history that it did. Years later, the county's memory of the scandal softened into the kind of story told fondly at dinner, rather than whispered at it. The Duchess of Ashcombe still kept a small case of surgical instruments in her private sitting room, used as often for tenant emergencies as any physician's. She still occasionally reminded a startled new housemaid or a visiting London relation in the same even voice she had used in a stable 11 years before. She had learned to set a bone at Millbrook Jail. She had never once been ashamed of the fact, because the shame, properly examined, had never belonged to her at all. The Dowager Duchess lived to see her first great-grandchild christened. She declared, from her chair by the nursery fire, that she had chosen better for her nephew than any matchmaking mother in 3 counties could have managed. She intended to remind everyone of the fact for as long as she drew breath, which she did with considerable relish, for 6 years more. Dr. Fenwick, aging and increasingly grateful for the assistance, eventually ceded the whole of the tenant rounds to the Duchess and her own trained apprentices. These were 3 girls drawn from the estate's poorer cottages, whom she had taught herself. No one objected. The Duke had made plain, from the first winter of their marriage, that his wife's judgment on the matter of who deserved a chance at a trade was not a subject open for debate. Their eldest daughter, Eleanor, would grow up watching her mother's hands work with the same steady competence. She would see her splint a groom's arm or steady a fevered brow with no more ceremony than she gave to pouring tea. She would herself train as a physician's apprentice, in an age just beginning, however grudgingly, to permit such things. She would ask her mother once, as a girl of perhaps 9, whether it had frightened her. All those years ago, had it frightened her to tell a duke the truth about a prison rather than invent a kinder history? Marianne considered the question with the same care she gave every question a child asked her in earnest. She told her daughter that the frightening thing had never been the truth itself, but the years spent believing it needed to be hidden. The truth, once spoken plainly in a stable doorway in the rain, had cost her nothing at all. It had given her, in the end, everything. A name restored, a household to govern, a man who had learned to reach instead of retreat. Her hands were never again required to hide what they knew how to do. It was a lesson the Duke of Ashcombe had learned first, mealing in that same doorway 11 years before. Worth is not conferred by circumstance. It is very often clearest in the people circumstance has tried hardest to bury.